everybody. Thank you for the intro, Barbara, and thank you for inviting me here to moderate this panel. It's a topic that I'm very interested in, and hopefully will have some interesting insights for us. So, according to government data, there's an estimated 2 million people in the UK experiencing self-reported long COVID as of January 2023, with symptoms adversely thought to affect the day-to-day activities of 1.5 million. As Barbara sort of touched on, fatigue is the most common, followed by difficulty concentrating, shortness of breath, and muscle ache, but other symptoms include sleep disturbances, anxiety, and depression. The prevalence of long COVID was greatest in people aged 35 to 69, in females, people living in more deprived areas, working in social care, or those with another activity-limiting health condition or disability. So it's clear that there's an urgent need to identify and trial new treatments for this condition, and there's been a growing interest in medical cannabis as a potential treatment. As we know, it's currently prescribed to patients in the UK for conditions such as chronic pain, anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, so there is great potential for it in long COVID as well. Last year, Drug Science carried out the first real clinical trial on a cannabis-based product in patients with long COVID, and I'm joined with Hannah Thurger, who's Senior Research Officer at Drug Science and who worked on the study, who will be able to tell us a bit more about that during this panel. Just before we start, I just want to acknowledge that while long COVID is a relatively new phenomenon, the symptoms mirror those of some syndromes such as post-viral fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME, which already affect hundreds of thousands of patients in the UK. These conditions are hard to treat, hard to diagnose, with no cure, and of which there is little awareness and understanding, even among the medical profession. So many feel that the renaming of these syndromes after when a new infection presents in a new location can be problematic because it prevents patients getting the treatment that they need. So for the purposes of this panel and beyond, I think it's important that when we talk about long COVID, we acknowledge all those in the post-viral patient group and the need for new treatments for not only long COVID, but those who've been living with these symptoms for many years, often in silence. So Kyle Esplin, who's one of those patients, is an entertainer and cannabis specialist and founder of Holistic Highland Hemp. In 2012, Kyle was struck down with a viral respiratory infection, which led to a long-term debilitating post-viral fatigue syndrome. He found CBD and full-spectrum oils helpful in managing and recovering from the condition, and since regaining health and functionality has been involved in developing the hemp and cannabis industry. It was actually Kyle and his Dr. Liz Iverson, who unfortunately couldn't make the panel today, who helped this research come to fruition. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Kindly stepping in for Dr. Iverson is Dr. Danny Gordon, one of the world-leading experts in cannabinoid and integrative holistic medicine. She's treated thousands of patients with medical cannabis and is the founder and medical director of the London Resilience Clinic, specialising in the holistic treatment of complex chronic illness, including a number of patients with long COVID. Hannah, as I mentioned, is Senior Research Officer at Drug Science. She's kindly stepping in for Michael Linsky today, who was due to be here, but unfortunately, and rather ironically, has got COVID. So, Kyle, I'm going to come to you first because I feel like it was your story where this all really started. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of how cannabis was helpful in managing those symptoms and helping you recover?
Sure, thanks very much here. So the symptoms, I always feel it's quite unfortunate when the focus is on fatigue, because most people have experience of fatigue after a viral infection. Actually, after I've had a run-in, I think, with COVID in this last while, I had fatigue for 2 or 3 months, but it was nothing like the all-encompassing syndrome that happened before. So it's a multi-system problem, and patients, in the worst case, end up with a long list of pretty much every symptom you could imagine, which is very difficult for doctors to treat, because there is no recognized treatment or cure, and targeting one symptom at a time when all of the systems seem to be out of balance doesn't have a successful result for patients. My case was quite typical of those who ended up in a bad situation with the post-viral fatigue syndrome or diagnosed with ME, where it had been a viral respiratory infection, and in over a period of about 6 months, things had steadily went downhill with little bumps in between until I was unable to look after myself, completely out of action, bedbound, housebound type thing. at that point, when the doctors had no solution, it was sort of a shrug of the shoulders. This has been going on for years, and there isn't anything. We can only treat some symptoms. And antidepressants was offered, but I said I wasn't suffering from depression. Why are you offering me antidepressants? And the doctor said that off-label, this could be used for the anti-inflammatory purpose. But from my perspective, I felt that there was multiple problems going on, and I asked the doctor, am I likely to suffer weight gain from these antidepressants? And the doctor said, yeah, that's a likely result. And so I said, why? What's the mechanism of action? Are these high in calories? Obviously not. And the doctor had no answer as to why I would gain weight. So we have to think about that. The doctor's going to give me a tablet. I'm suffering metabolic problems and amongst everything else. And it turns out that gut dysbiosis from antidepressants is the mechanism of action as to why people gain weight. And gut dysbiosis of the microbiota is well connected to ongoing symptoms of ME post-viral. So at that point, when I knew it wasn't a cure, I wasn't wanting to try and treat symptoms because I'd seen and came across and was in contact with so many patients who had been like 15, 20 years, just disappeared, you know. And so that's when I started looking into alternatives and decided to try cannabis. Yep. So how it helped me in a different way was I traveled to Holland because this was 2013 before it was available in the UK. And at clinic there, it was obvious. Within a few days, all the symptoms were toning down. They just quietened all the symptoms and could start to recover from there.
I was just going to say, Jenny, is this something that resonates with you in your experience?
Yeah, so I've been treating chronic complex conditions using integrative cannabinoid medicine for, I guess, almost a decade and a half now. And long before, as Kyle pointed out, we were emailing back and forth the panel before, and Kyle, you said, we really should acknowledge this post-viral group because finally, I've been treating post-viral fatigue, chronic fatigue, ME, whatever you want to call it. It's a bucket of conditions because it's so complex, and everyone's ME is slightly different than the next person's, and this is what's not recognized. So what happens when you have these patients come to you? They've been to every conventional medicine doctor. They've often been to a naturopath, they've been to a nutritionist, and no one's really putting the pieces together because there's immune dysfunction, there's a lot of microbiome, gut dysfunction, increased intestinal permeability oftentimes. I like to say that versus leaky gut, because when you say leaky gut, people just laugh at you. But when you say increased intestinal permeability, then some colleagues actually listen. And then you have probably some endocannabinoid system dysregulation, which is probably why cannabinoids do help. They also seem to have an anti-inflammatory effect. They probably have an immunomodulatory effect. And then you have a brain networking component as well. So it depends what the trigger was. Sometimes it's post-viral fatigue. I also have patients in my practice who had a traumatic trigger. They had a bereavement, a death, and then they just never got better. So there can be different groups as well. And what my approach is in integrated medicine, what we do is we use functional medicine. We use kind of a root cause approach, although sometimes you can't find a root cause for everything, it's true. But we use that approach combined with medications. And this seems to work really well for these post-viral fatigue syndromes. So I do use cannabis, and everyone is different when it comes to long COVID and post-viral fatigue with their response to cannabis. I have some patients in the practice who were teens. They were healthy teenagers and in their early 20s, and then they got COVID, and then now they've been by the time they get to see me, they've often been in bed, for months. And what we have to do with each of those patients is slightly different. I had a patient recently who was so sensitive, even to 1 milligram of THC. That it made her better for a few hours, and she got energy for the first time, but then she crashed. And this is like the smallest dose you can give someone. And then I have other patients who need 20 milligrams of THC to help them sleep. So it's really cannabis is really a personalized medicine in the context of an illness that needs to be completely personalized to the patient, and that's why it's so difficult with conventional medicine to cope with these conditions. Even in the long COVID clinics, all of my patients who come to me for long COVID, they've already been to the long COVID clinic. They were taught about pacing. They got some CBT. They got some support. Those things were helpful to some extent, but it's not helping with the underlying mechanisms of their illness. And that's really where we need more therapies, more research. And the only silver lining I see with COVID is, well, one of the only ones, is that at least post-viral fatigue has a face now. People are not actually laughing at it anymore. People, other doctors are actually taking it seriously now, versus with ME for a long time it was just, you just need to go see a psychiatrist, get some talk therapy. It drove my patients crazy. They said, oh my gosh, I'd love to just do talk therapy if it worked, but it doesn't change their illness progression, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And so I'm going to come on and we're just going to touch on the study a little bit now. So last year, Drug Science carried out an open-label clinical trial on the effects of medical cannabis in 12 patients with long COVID. That's my understanding. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the study and what its aims and objectives were?
Yeah, of course. So this, as you said, was an open-label phase 2 clinical trial, which means that everyone received the study drug. So the study drug in this trial was provided by BOD Australia and was Medicabilis Cannabis Sativa 50, which is a full-spectrum product, and it's oil-based. So participants could be prescribed up to 150 mg of CBD and 6 mg of THC per day. That's the total daily dose. So participants were enrolled for a period of 6 months, and in the first month there was a period of titration where the dose was slowly increased up, and in the final month there was a period whereby the dose was slowly decreased down. Patient-reported outcome measures were collected every month, and this was via the EVA app from Altaflora, as well as daily symptoms for 7 days per 28 days each month. And then participants also wore a Fitbit, and the Fitbit was to be able to collect wearable data, so measures such as sleep, heart rate variability, as well as blood oxygen saturation and activity levels. So this was a phase 2 feasibility study, which means that the primary objectives were really looking at recruitment, retention and tolerability, looking really at the safety of this CBD dominant-based cannabis product in a long COVID population. And really our secondary outcome measures, which were looking at a variety of long COVID symptoms using a specific long COVID questionnaire developed by a research team in Leeds, and then other standardized questionnaires looking at pain, quality of life, fatigue, anxiety and depression were much more exploratory measures and weren't powered for statistical analysis in this study.
Great, thank you. And what are your sort of findings from that, and what can we draw conclusions from?
So looking really at our primary objectives, so just to remind you, recruitment, retention and tolerability. We did have some issues of recruitment, so we only recruited 12 participants and had hoped to recruit 30. And then, but this was due to our restrictive geographical catchment area up in North and the Yorkshire region. And then in terms of retention, no one had to withdraw due to adverse side effects. And we had a high completion rate of our assessments, which was relatively intensive to have monthly questionnaires every month, as well as for 7 days per 28 to have to answer daily questions, which was very promising, as well as attending the monthly clinical assessments. And in looking really at the safety, it was well tolerated. There were no serious adverse events. What was interesting, looking at some of the adverse events, was one of the most common adverse events was when participants slowly reduced their dose, and at their final clinical assessments, they had some deterioration of their long COVID symptoms after coming off the medication, as well as in a few participants, irritation associated with the Fitbit, which was unexpected.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to touch on the small sample size because it was quite small. I think it was smaller than what we were hoping for. And Cal, feel free to jump in here as well because I think you were hoping for a slightly larger sample. And you know, you were trying to reach GPs and long COVID clinics. What were some of the challenges that you faced in that process?
So I think that's a really good question. So we were completing this study outside of either a university or outside of an NHS clinical research network. So really going forward, you need to have strong links with NHS research networks who have time dedicated to help with recruitment and specifically have people placed within long COVID clinics who will be able to support recruitment. I think without having that infrastructure in place, you'll have these challenges which are really hard to overcome.
Yeah, thank you. And do you have any thoughts on that, Kyle?
I'd just say, I would have thought in this circumstance, in the middle of this pandemic, which has interrupted the whole world, there could have been a bit more participation in the trial. You know, it was, I think from last January when they hoped to get 30 and sort of by summer, so it was delayed getting the trial underway. And myself and Dr. Iveson were on Sky Breakfast News talking about it that there was going to be a trial, and I think maybe 4 of the 12 had came through me. So it was like in the middle of this pandemic, it's quite baffling that we couldn't get 30 people together after 6 months. Still couldn't get 30 people. That's quite baffling. And I've asked different people how that is, and I think there's different reasons with the specials medicines and NHS and GPs cooperating. And there was also this sort of message of the general overwhelm of the situation of so many patients, they've got the long COVID clinics, you go there for some time, that doesn't work, the system's busy, and it's a real shame it got over because, as you so eloquently ran through, Dr. Danny there, those were all the points I was aware of in the research from a layman's perspective as to why I was going to take cannabis extract, and it worked out to be on point in theory. So yeah, wish we had more involved or more attention to it, or I'm not sure what's the answer.
But I think, on the positive side, I think you guys would all agree that, I spoke to Liz about this, is at least now you guys have set the groundwork for someone to come in and do the next phase of the study, and that actually makes a big difference, believe it or not. Even the research design that you've done and the feasibility, when you're applying to do the next phase of a study like this, it's easier to get it approved. I mean, these things are so bureaucratic, but actually it's really, really important work. So I know if you're not a scientist, if you're not in the academic community, this seems like, oh, it's just 12 people, but actually this is a really, really important piece of work. So well done, you guys, because I was in contact with Liz a lot through this, and I know how challenging it is. I think the other thing to be said is, from my point of view, in our clinic, we're an integrated medicine clinic. We're not a cannabis clinic. And I often get patients from the other cannabis clinics who come to us because they've got some benefit from cannabis, but it hasn't been personalized enough to them, and they haven't done the other integrated pieces. So, I'm doing gut testing. I use really comprehensive stool testing, functional medicine testing with patients. I put them on mitochondrial support. So with any kind of long COVID or post-viral fatigue syndrome, and you're right, it's not just fatigue. We're not talking about, people just think, oh, they're just a bit tired. Can't they just get up and do something? We're talking about, first of all, brain fatigue, central fatigue, and we're talking about brain fog. Like, the worst symptoms my patients have, it's not the fatigue. They're like, I could just have a coffee if it was just fatigue, if it was just really bad fatigue. It's the brain fog, it's the cognitive dysfunction. They cannot function. So you have to look at the immune system dysfunction, you have to look at the mitochondrial dysfunction, and you have to look at the gut, and all of these different pieces pulled together. And I'm not anti-medication. It's not that at all. I often get asked, "Oh, are you against pharmaceuticals?" I say, "Well, absolutely not. I'm all for what works, but in these types of syndromes, conventional pharmaceuticals are not normally that helpful. You get the occasional case where it is somewhat helpful, but normally it's not. Normally, my patients have tried all those things and they haven't worked." So I do think cannabis plays an important role, and often what I do when I see these patients, especially the ones who are really, really sick, is we start with cannabis, because if you're really overwhelmed and you have cognitive dysfunction, How can you engage in a really complicated program? You cannot at that point. It's as you probably can remember, you're just trying to do one thing at a time. So if we can get them a little bit more energy, a little bit more functional with the cannabis, then they can engage. And then I say, okay, then the next thing we're going to do is, even doing a stool test for someone, trying to collect these functional medicine samples. Most of my patients in the beginning are too sick to do them, just to even put the cognitive steps together that they need. Okay, I have to, take the sample, then I have to call the shipper and send it off. So it's the cannabis, I find, is a catalyst often for them to be able to engage with the next steps of their program and their recovery program. And it's the only thing that I have found that's actually able to do this. So it's a really unique medicine for me.
Yeah, that's really important and really interesting. And one thing I do just want to touch on is that the product in the trial was a CBD dominant, I think. And I want to explore some of the benefits that THC can have as well, which I know you've seen in Clinic Danny and you've seen as well, Kyle. So I'll just open that up to whoever kind of wants to, but I think we need to talk about THC as well. And Hannah, if you have any insight on the reasons for just the CBD prominent product being used.
I don't know about you. I've had such different reactions to CBD and THC ratios for post-viral fatigue syndromes. I have one patient who responded so well to a really high CBD product. The CBD itself, the high CBD product, actually helped with her fatigue, like directly helped with her measures of fatigue. I have other patients where it didn't do anything. I had to add THC. Sometimes what I find when I work with post-viral fatigue syndromes and just chronic fatigue syndromes, including those with a traumatic trigger as well, is, I don't know if I'm so interested to see if you found this, that inhaled cannabis works better to lift the fatigue than the oils. I have a lot of patients where the oils just don't work for the fatigue, but they help with you also get this achy pain, you get a lot of other dysfunction with these syndromes that the oil can help with, and as a baseline. Yeah, but often my patients need the inhaled.
Interesting about that, because actually this is a big thing I'm feeling as a patient as well, from, let's say, previous experience in going to the clinics in Holland and what I'd describe as a traditional use of just botanical extract. And the big difference here is, and I have had less positive results with some of the oils that are available, and the number one reason is because they're all 100% decarboxylated, and that's not what we did in history. And once you pass 70% decarboxylation, you start degrading the other compounds faster than you're activating them, and because of stability, we're not going to get more raw formulations, I think, on the market at the moment, but those were the ones I found to be more beneficial. And I think there's various reasons, other plant parts that are just left in there in the process, but that 100% decarboxylated I found to be not as good as I knew it could be, a plant extract for the energy, and in that circumstance, given the choice of the two, inhalation better.
Yeah. And in Canada, we had more options, obviously. So I used to use extracts that had a combination of THC and THCA. Of course, THCA is very unstable. So, you put it on your on a shelf, on a windowsill near the sun, and it turns into THC. So you always have to make patients aware of that. But I would use more extracts in Canada with more THCA, especially in patients who could not tolerate daytime THC, because it made them feel dizzy or more kind of out of it. The patients who are very, very sensitive, especially in the beginning of their treatment. Oftentimes when people get better, they can handle more THC, and it helps them with the next set of their symptoms. It depends, like I always say with my patients, it's about doing the right thing at the right time in integrated medicine. What I've learned over the years, when I first started out doing integrated medicine, you get so excited, you have all these tools and all these functional medicine tests, and you just want to do everything at once. But it's not the right thing to do. First of all, it's very expensive for patients, and second of all, if it's not the right time for that particular intervention or that particular diagnostic tool, then you don't get the best results. And it's the same with cannabis.
And just to pick up on what you were saying, Danny, this is a very personalised medicine approach. Obviously, with the clinical trial, it's a lot more restrictive. And that did play a factor in having a CBD-dominant cannabis-based medicinal product, which tends to be well tolerated. Though it's interesting what you were saying, that you have some patients who are particularly sensitive to THC. And we did have a participant in the trial who was particularly sensitive and actually had to have the dose reduced via protocol deviation. So there needs to be some type of flexibility within study designs to enable that, because it's important for clinicians to be able to spot if someone has these sensitivities. And this is where clinical trials, just by their very nature and their restrictiveness in terms of study design, can have their limitations when it requires this very specific approach for patients.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I did want to sort of get into real world evidence. I'm conscious that we've only got 5 minutes left, and 30 minutes isn't very long for a complex topic like this. But just briefly, I guess, what is the value of real world evidence in conditions like this that are so complex and when treating with cannabis medicine?
So with real-world evidence, it doesn't have the same limitations of restrictive clinical trials. So clinical trials often have eligibility criteria which might restrict patients or participants who have comorbidities or who are taking other medications, which means it lacks ecological validity. Whereas with real-world evidence, you have these broad sets of patients taking broad types of medications, different ratios of CBD, THC, other cannabinoids and terpenes. And you can collect this data over a longer period, and it's this value in patient-reported outcome measures, looking at different types of symptoms, as well as quality of life over longer periods of time. And there's real value in that to try and see how more representative populations of patients respond to different types of cannabis-based products, as well as being able to have this more personalised approach to their therapy as well.
Yeah. And I think one thing to say is, people in medicine often think you can't scale personalized medicine. How's it ever going to scale to the NHS? However, the answer is real-world evidence and real-world data. So, I'm working on a platform at the moment which is going to hopefully help standardize holistic medicine, including cannabinoids, because there are ways to do it. If you get a big enough sample set of people, as you know, and you have them collect the measures in the same way, the patient-reported outcomes in the same way, and you do it in a way that's really patient-friendly, you can actually get some really useful data, and you can start to standardize these things. And this is why complex chronic illness is poorly treated, because without this kind of holistic, and I don't mean holistic as in, throwing crystals at people, I'm talking about, a very evidence-based holistic approach here. But unless we get our heads around that, complex chronic illness is going to continue to be very poorly treated, and it's going to cost the system more money, and it's going to continue, the problem is just going to keep ballooning and ballooning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to kind of wrap this up, I wanted to touch on the fact that this sort of long COVID, post-viral fatigue syndromes, these really hard to treat conditions seem to have like the most promise for cannabis medicine, because these patients are really kind of at our last resort. They've been, I think, Cal, you described them as the missing millions, which really is quite poignant. So I just wondered if each of you could kind of, I guess, summarise where we're at now, and how do we get these medicines kind of into the hands of patients who really need them, and what do we need to get there?
I can go first. So obviously there could be further studies that are more placebo-controlled to specifically test the efficacy of a cannabis-based product. So looking more at the secondary outcome measures, which our study was empowered to assess, as well as, of course, we're in a world now where medical cannabis is available across different jurisdictions. So it's really important that real-world evidence is collected to really understand what subgroups of patients this could potentially help, especially with long COVID and other post-viral fatigue syndromes. Also, the use of wearable technology to look at specific markers such as like heart rate variability could really be used to kind of guide treatment potentially. So I think it's kind of having this multi-pronged approach to kind of gather the best data possible.
Yeah, I just echo what you said. I think we need obviously more research. It has to be real-world evidence-based because of the nature of, the conditions we're treating and the nature of the products that we're treating them with. So that, and I guess, just more public awareness, more awareness among doctors that this can be a valid way of practicing medicine. There's this really narrow idea of evidence-based medicine. I like to think of it as evidence-informed medicine, which is a bit broader. So I think these are some of the directions.
I think the public awareness is actually, it is raising awareness, but also for people to get on and do it themselves. I'm all for patients having access in some way, while medical also figures this out in the long term, because it was 2012 when I was looking at this, didn't see any studies on the horizon, rituximab was trialed, it didn't go well, and I thought this could be years before anything's going to be available for this condition, and we've got to start, we've got a trial coming up, but patients need access, and I think the medical side has to actually hurry up with their participation, otherwise there's going to be a bit of a runaway train of folks looking after themselves in that regard because they've been left without help.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you all for joining me. And I'm sure Danny, Hannah and Cal will be around for the day, or some of the day, if anyone's got any questions and you'd like to speak to them individually. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.